Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam, making another video out of Madrid, where I've been working the past week and a half. And in today's video, I want to reflect on a notion that became clearer this week during my visit to the city. And it has to do with the dissolution of perceptual boundaries and how we can systematically allow perception to come ever closer and become more immersive, and how that happens both when we do self-inquiry but also when we do feder work. And by feder work I mean specifically regarding the resolution of emotional hang-ups and personal trauma. And sometimes they're one and the same, as a matter of fact. Sometimes as we ask, who am I, we come across those emotional little hiccups, little pools or pain somewhere in the central channel that can be linked to specific instances. Now, if I take a step back when it comes to the process, and we read some of the literature when it comes to self-inquiry, or let's say exercising presence of awareness and asking who am I, or orienting your attention to try to find out who the witness is, most of the advice that I've come across tells us that we need to observe the observer relentlessly and to try to find who am I and orient our attention inward in a relentless kind of way. And I, for a long time, had struggled with this, and I didn't really believe it was possible. I thought that given the amount of distractions out there and the amount of distractions in here, that my attention would forever be hijacked in every possible direction, and that keeping a sustained practice or a sustained mode of meditative awareness throughout the day was impossible. I'm glad to report that even though my awareness is not sustained 100% of the time, that the gaps have become few and far in between, and whenever they are found, they are also systematically used for the cleanup of the psyche, if we could call it that. So it is definitely possible. It just requires that you establish, that you really establish a regular practice, that you try to really immerse yourself in the world of meditation, self-realization, reading books, listening to talks. I've spoken about the channel Samaniri Hayasara before. She is wonderful when it comes to things that you can sort of play in the background and simply listen to Vedanta coming into the back of your mind while you're, I don't know, doing the dishes or activities that don't require serious focus. And things become serious when you start to notice a direct relationship between your formal practice and constant self-inquiry throughout the day, and moments of pristine clarity and this sort of numinous, really majestic feeling where everything comes together and becomes super beautiful around you. It's sort of the start of the non-dual. You can go into deep non-duality, but it doesn't even need to be that deep. You simply get this sort of all-encompassing, all-embracing feel of, or rather field of experience that becomes singular, and it feels incredibly wholesome. So your mind starts to become almost obsessed and gravitating towards that if you put in the work and you start to make the relation between the work and the result. And when this starts to happen, uh, things get both, as I mentioned in the previous video, both incredibly interesting, but the price you pay is that a lot of affects start to find their way to your conscious awareness. It's almost like you have paved a neural road between a lot of the affects that you hold in your subconscious and in your deep subconscious, somewhere in the heart, the belly, or your solar plexus, and um, they start to kind of now feel like they can have safe passage to your conscious mind. And when they come up, they are incredibly uncomfortable. They're very uncomfortable. They are psychologically uncomfortable, but they are also somatically uncomfortable. You can feel very raw sometimes. And yet, something in you understands that that is precisely the process running, and that you ought to do your best to allow this to happen and to just surrender to the process and keep surrendering to the process over and over again. Now, it is interesting to notice that these waves of discomfort, when properly surrendered to and allowed, can lead precisely to the very pristine and unified awareness that you are often craving for. But that pristine and unified awareness, wholesome as it may feel, also feels incredibly, and I'm using the word advisedly here, incredibly invasive. It is as if for the longest time you had been using a kind of attentional membrane, not attentional as in tension, but attentional as in your attention, had always hit a membrane in which whenever there was input coming from the outside that you didn't know exactly how to handle or you couldn't be bothered with, then your attention would very cleverly and automatically bounce to a space of memory and imagination and selfhood, if we could call it that. So that for the longest time, so long as you feel that you are a self, you can assume that you had been using a kind of implicit and automatic protection mechanism that functions as I said, as a membrane to prevent experience from being felt directly. You were keeping experience at bay, or you were kind of recoiling away from direct experience because you can't bear it. So raw experience is almost an affront, and it can't be borne directly. And in order to bear it indirectly, you erect this notion of being a self, and that selfhood is nothing but a way for your attention to go elsewhere other than direct experience. And therefore it goes towards direct experience when it likes it, and away from it when it dislikes it. And it's kind of this, it's almost like an interruption switch, right? That the self, and this may be an analogy that I've used once before, the selfing mechanism is almost the desire to preserve the prerogative to switch away from direct experience and into mental la-la land or mental fantasy whenever direct experience doesn't fit your preconceptions of how things should be. Now, that's precisely what we're giving up. So we are, once we embark in the path of self-realization and cultivation, and once we become real adepts, and by that I mean once we are really willing to confront discomfort and things that are painful because we have a bigger goal in mind, once we orient towards that and we get what Shinzen Young calls a taste for purification, in other words, submitting yourself to regular doses of pain in order to clarify your system, then what begins to happen is experience starts to become progressively more direct. And as I said, direct experience, especially when dislikable, but also when likable, this is interesting, feels incredibly invasive to the ego, because when experience is direct, or rather, the more direct experience is, the more direct perception is, the less room there is for the egoic mechanism to stay in place, or to be believed in as an entity. Yeah, so this switch of looking away, looking towards, looking away, looking towards, looking away, craving and aversion, right? It it is so pervasive and so implicit that it passes for an entity. It disguises itself under the label of my separate identity. That's how it feels, yeah? And you could see it the other way around. Take, for example, take a plant. Now, a plant receives direct sunlight and turns it into chlorophyll. And there may be some primitive mechanism in the plant that recoils away from pesticides or predators or pests and things of that kind, and towards the sun. But it is so primitive that it has no, most likely, I'm speaking of on behalf of plants now, but it's so rudimentary that it has no self-awareness. And so it cannot kid itself into believing that recoiling away from pain and moving towards pleasure is some sort of entity. It is simply a chemical reaction that's doing it. Yeah? So the plant is entirely immersed in its medium. There's nothing mediating between the environment and the plant. They function as a single mechanism. The sun shines and the sunflower turns. That's it. There's no one turning. Yeah. For ourselves, it's exactly the same, except that because we have this very sophisticated mechanism of likes and dislikes, and a lot of psychology in between, then it seems as if there is an entity deciding to turn away from pain and to orient itself towards pleasure. Now, as you allow experience to touch directly, and what it's touching is itself. So as you allow experience to touch itself directly, and for attention not to look away into parts of the mind that are not dealing with direct perception, then the ego begins to get squeezed out of the equation. And it just feels like direct experience, which is very invasive. I was at the Prado Museum a couple of days ago, and several of the paintings there elicited a full non-dual merging with the painting. It was a phenomenal experience. Not all of them did, and I wasn't really doing it. It kind of clicked in certain places, and when it did, I sort of pushed the button to go all in, so to speak, and it was very, very interesting. But there was no place for me left in that equation. It was just the painting being rendered in consciousness. And it was so direct that whatever ego is left in me couldn't help but wonder, wait a second, if I go in this direction, there's no control left. There's no leeway. There is no boundary left. There's nothing keeping experience at bay anymore, because I become the moment. I become experience. And therefore, there's no mediation. And that means all bets are off, as a matter of fact, right? That's exactly what it means. So the ego keeps recoiling away from that. But you need not try to convince the ego not to do that, or you need not try to, somehow convince yourself that this is the thing to do, that you should become non-dual or whatever. All that's necessary is to, as I said, work on your psychosomatics, especially the problematic ones, and allow experience to come ever closer to that which feels like I, and to keep watching whatever it is that feels like I, to come and notice that what feels like I is a kind of recoiling away from direct experience. And if you do that systematically over time, and you have a little bit of courage, and whatever talks you're listening to or books you're reading encourage you to trust that what's on the other side of that exercise is nothing to be afraid of, then non-duality will start to inevitably arise. It's inevitable. It's a neurological certainty. As a matter of fact, you're simply connecting things with your attention. You're connecting different parts of the mind. And whether that then has bigger implications on the what's real type of question, that's I don't know what to say about it just yet. I'm just now reading a book by Stanislav Grof called When the Impossible Happens, in which he tells stories about things that supposedly prove that the connection, or rather than the distinction between mind and matter, is not as clear cut as we would like it to be. I'm reading the book with a rather skeptical eye, and I'm still not convinced, I have to say. But once again, fully open. And I mean, I've spoken about magic before. At least from a subjective level, it's definitely there. But I am yet to see something on the objective external world that would make me think that this is not simply a work of internal mental integration. So I want to be very, very cautious there. But boy, would I be happy to have some cities or some interesting thing happen, right? Like, full disclosure, we are warned against these things, but one cannot help but be curious about them. So that's today's video. It's about, in essence, this idea of squeezing the ego out by allowing direct experience to touch that which feels like I, which is nothing other than resistance to direct experience, and how invasive direct experience feels when we start to allow that to happen. And that should be a hallmark that we're moving in the correct direction. So thanks for listening to this one. I'm very curious to hear what you guys make of it, as usual, and I'll be back with more videos pretty soon. If you think that these talks are handy and might be helpful to others, then your liking, sharing, and subscribing is always appreciated. And thanks again. I'll be back with more pretty soon. Cheerio. Bye.